Hello everybody, and thank you for joining me for another tier list. Today we're going to be going through the discography of Led Zeppelin, the legendary English rock band who were one of the early contributors to styles like hard rock and metal, which were starting to become more and more prevalent in the late 60s and early 70s, and they are a group whose influence is incredibly far-reaching, and they've released countless songs and albums that will forever be timeless, and they've clearly cemented themselves as one of the greatest and most influential bands of the late 60s and 70s. And I've been a huge Led Zeppelin fan ever since I was in high school, which is going on 20 years now, so they are long overdue for a tier list, and I'm glad to have finally gotten around to them for today's episode. So what I'm going to do is go through their 8 studio albums, starting with Led Zeppelin I and going up to In Through the Outdoor, and I will also be including their compilation album Coda, and I will score each of them on this tier list, with S being the highest and D being the lowest, and I'll talk a little bit about each album, let you know my thoughts, and we will see where we end up. And please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree and how you would rank these 9 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. Alright, I think that's about it. Let's jump right into it. Okay, starting out, we have their debut studio album from 1969, which is a self-titled album, Led Zeppelin, or a lot of people refer to it as Led Zeppelin I, and I will give this an A. I think this is a very good debut record, but I do think they have a couple of other albums that are a bit stronger, but this certainly has some really great qualities to it, and it contains numerous tracks that are classic Led Zeppelin hits. It's 9 tracks long, with 4 songs on side 1 and 5 songs on side 2, and 4 of the 9 songs on here are covers, with the majority of them happening on side 1, and the album does a great job of giving us a nice blend of the hard rock and metal elements mixed with a little bit of folk rock and blues. Side 1 opens up with Good Times, Bad Times, which is a classic Led Zeppelin hit, and about as perfect of an opening track as they could have chosen for their first record. Just hitting you right off the bat with a really rocking track that does a great job of showcasing the impressive musicianship in the group between John Bonham's awesome drum grooves, particularly in his fast kick drum parts, which are very impressive, and Jimmy Page delivers some awesome guitar solos, and Robert Plant and John Paul Jones deliver some amazing performances. So again, I think this is the perfect opening track, and I absolutely love the follow-up song, Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You, a beautiful cover of a folk song that was written in the late 50s, and a great contrast to the harder hitting opening track. Then we go into the bluesy territory with a cover of You Shook Me, and for me personally, the blues tracks on this album are some of the songs that do take away from this record a little bit. They're not bad songs, but I don't find their bluesy tracks to be as exciting or as engaging as a lot of the other songs on this record. And Led Zeppelin is a band that does explore a lot of different styles of music, so we are all naturally going to resonate more with different styles of their writing, and for me the blues stuff is always the stuff that I tend to resonate with the least. But luckily after that, side 1 concludes with by far my favorite song from this album and a top 10 favorite Led Zeppelin track for me, Dazed and Confused. And a lot of people are not aware of this, but this one is actually also a cover song. It was originally written by a guy named Jake Holmes, and he had performed this song when he was opening up for the Yardbirds, which was how Jimmy Page had heard it, and I love their interpretation of this track, and the original is also very cool and well worth checking out, and to me this is hands down the standout track from the entire record. Side 2 then delivers 5 more tracks, and for me this is one of those records where I do think the first half is a little bit stronger than the second half. I still like most of the songs on side 2, but I do think the momentum does die down the tiniest bit. For me, the 2 standout tracks on side 2 would be Communication Breakdown, which a lot of people regard as Led Zeppelin's first metal song and another classic from their discography, and I also really enjoy Black Mountain Side, which is an instrumental acoustic song that veers into some raga rock territory, and I think this is a great Jimmy Page feature and adds a nice little stylistic variety within the track listing. And for me, those would be the 2 high points of side 2. I don't think the remainder of side 2 is bad, I just don't think it's as exciting in comparison to a lot of the other tracks that would come out on future releases. But regardless of that, it's still a great album. It's got a decent amount of stylistic stylistic variety. It does have a track or two that I could do without, but at the same time, the good tracks on here are of such high quality that it really doesn't take away from the album very much for me. And I think it's a great starting point for them to continue to build their sound off of on their future records. So a solid debut record. This one is going to get an A. Okay, next we have their second studio album, also from 1969, titled Led Zeppelin II, and I'm going to give this one an S. I think this is an amazing album, and definitely an improvement from the previous release, particularly in terms of the consistency of the track listing. Stylistically, it is a bit heavier than the first album, and is mostly centered within that hard rock, metal, and blues realm, with not much of the folk elements that we heard on the previous record being present on here. And I really like how heavy this album is. If I'm in the mood for a nice hard-hitting, down and dirty rock album, this is a great listening choice. It's 9 tracks long with 4 songs on side 1 and 5 songs on side 2. And similar to the previous release, we have a mixture of 6 originals and 3 reinterpretations of different Chicago blues songs. And this track listing is just jam-packed with so many classic Led Zeppelin songs. Side 1 kicks off beautifully with Whole Lotta Love, a timeless Led Zeppelin song with one of the early John Bonham drum solo features, and then that is followed up beautifully with What Is and What Should Never Be, which would probably be my favorite song from this album. I love the dynamic shifts between the sections, and the psychedelic production style on the vocal parts in the verse is very cool. The only track I've never been crazy about on here would be the Lemon song. Like I said on the previous record, the blues stuff doesn't always resonate with me as much, so just a stylistic preference on my part. But side 1 concludes beautifully with Thank You, which is a very pretty song with amazing organ sounds and beautiful guitar parts, and just a nice song that's a little less heavy than a lot of the other tracks on this record, which provides a nice contrast. Side 2 I think is almost perfect from front to back, and it almost plays through like a greatest hits album with so many classic Led Zeppelin tracks back to back with Heartbreaker, Living Loving Maid, Ramble On, and Moby Dick. All amazing tracks that are unique in their own regard. That Heartbreaker guitar solo from Jimmy Page is absolutely legendary, and Moby Dick gives us a further showcase of John Bonham's impressive drum chops with a 3-minute long drum solo. If I had to pick a favorite song from side 2, I would have to go with Ramble On. I love the mixing of the acoustic and electric guitars, and I've always particularly loved the bass and drum groove on the chorus. Just super groovy and really showcases the deep pocket between John Bonham and John Paul Jones. And like I said, side 2 is almost perfect, and the reason for saying almost is because I'm not a huge fan of the closing track, Bring It On Home, which is another one in the bluesy realm. I do think the guitar parts are cool when it picks up halfway through, but in the grand scheme of this album, I would say this is one of the more underwhelming tracks. And although there are 2 tracks that I could do without, I think the remaining 7 songs are so unbelievably strong that it wouldn't feel right putting it anywhere but in S tier. So an incredible record that was a further improvement from Led Zeppelin I, and it produced countless classic Led Zeppelin hits, so this one gets an easy S. Alright, next we have their third studio album from 1970 titled Led Zeppelin III, and I will give this an A. This is an interesting album that a lot of fans seem to be divided on. A lot of people regard this as their best album, while others have it somewhere in the middle, and I've always resonated more with the latter. I do enjoy this record a lot, and it has a lot of great qualities to it, but they do have a couple of other albums that I do like a bit more. The biggest thing that I can say in favor of this record is that the production improves significantly in comparison to the first 2 releases. This sounds much cleaner and much more refined, and stylistically they stretch their sound out even more and do this great mixture of hard rock and blues, but then take it into much more of an acoustic folk direction, particularly on side 2, and instrumentally they also stretch it out much more with the inclusion of mandolin, synthesizers, double bass, hand percussion, banjo, and a string section, so it was definitely their most ambitious and daring album up to this point, which I really appreciate, and I do really enjoy almost all of this album, but I just think that I resonate with the tracks on a couple of their other records a bit more. Not to say that any of these songs are bad songs by any stretch, and there are a handful of tracks on here that I would regard as exceptional Led Zeppelin songs, but in light of all of that stuff, I've just never found myself considering this to be one of my favorite Led Zeppelin albums like so many other people do, but I can certainly understand why some people feel that way. It's 10 tracks long with 5 songs on each side, and it opens up perfectly with Immigrant Song, which would definitely be a top 10 favorite Led Zeppelin track for me, and probably my favorite opening song of any of their albums. For side 1, I also really love Friends. The guitar parts and string sections in particular on this one I think are very pretty, and I know I said on the previous records that I don't always resonate with the bluesy tracks of Led Zeppelin, but Since I've Been Loving You is hands down my favorite blues song of their discography. Such an awesome track with some really amazing guitar solos from Jimmy Page. So another thing that is very favorable about this record, it does contain a blues song that I really love. And then side 2 goes into much more of that acoustic folky direction, and my favorites from this side would be That's the Way and Tangerine. I do like side 1 a bit more. I've never been a huge fan of the closer, Hats Off to Roy Harper, which is one of the reasons for putting this in A tier, but in general I just think all of the high points of this record happen on side 1, and even my favorite acoustic folk track on here also happens on side 1 with the track Friends. But like I said, it's still an amazing album that showed a further evolution and experimentation of the Led Zeppelin sound and still produced some really amazing tracks, and a couple that would make my top 10 list like Immigrant Song and Since I've Been Loving You. But I still like it slightly less than a couple of the albums that I will be putting in S tier, so ultimately because of that, this one is going to get an A. Okay, next we have their 4th studio album from 1971 titled Led Zeppelin IV, and this one gets an easy S. This is a spectacular record, and for me this goes down as my second favorite Led Zeppelin album. In my opinion, it is the best installment of their first 4 self-titled studio albums, and of those 4 records, I do think this one is definitely the most consistent from front to back. It's packed with so many classic Led Zeppelin hits and almost plays through like a greatest hits album. It's 8 tracks long with 4 songs on each side, and stylistically I think they did a great job of writing songs that incorporate all of the different sounds that they had explored up to that point, with the hard rock elements on tracks like Black Dog, Rock and Roll, and When the Levee Breaks, and then we also get some of the folk elements on Stairway to Heaven, which is really a blend of multiple different styles, but it definitely starts out in more of a folk realm, as well as Going to California and the Battle of Evermore, which is a duet between Robert Plant and Sandy Denny from Fairport Convention, which was a really nice little feature for this record, and I liked the Celtic elements that this song gave us. Another new sound that we hadn't heard from Led Zeppelin up to this point, and in addition to the hard rock and folk styles, we also hear some more progressive elements start to creep in on Misty Mountain Hop and 4 Sticks. Misty Mountain Hop has some really interesting 3/4 polyrhythms in the vocal melody, and 4 Sticks alternates between 5/8 and 6/8, which might be the first example of a Led Zeppelin song to utilize odd time signatures, which is definitely a feature of progressive rock. And this is a very clear precursor to a style of writing that they would delve into even deeper on their next album. And I think the incredibly consistent track listing, combined with their hard rock and folk rock roots, and the inclusion of these new progressive elements, resulted in one of the best albums of their discography and the perfect conclusion to this 4 self-titled album run. As far as favorite songs on here would go for me, for side 1 I would have to go with Black Dog, and side 2 I would have to go with Going to California and When the Levee Breaks. Going to California is my all-time favorite Led Zeppelin ballad. I think that song is exceptionally beautiful, and obviously Stairway to Heaven is one of Led Zeppelin's most classic songs, and it's a beautifully constructed piece, and it's an awesome song, but as is the case with me, and I'm sure a lot of people listening to this, it is one of those songs that I have just heard so many times at this point in my life that I don't find myself going back to it very often, but obviously it goes without saying that it's an amazing track and one of their most timeless songs to come from their entire discography. So an amazing record that would go down as my second favorite Led Zeppelin album. This one gets an easy S. Alright, next we have their fifth studio album from 1973 titled Houses of the Holy, and this one is also going to get an easy S. I absolutely love this record, and this one actually goes down as my number one favorite Led Zeppelin album. Some people might be surprised to hear that. People do seem to be all over the place with this record. I know it doesn't typically make the top of a lot of people's lists, but in my opinion, I think they knocked it out of the park with this one, delivering a super consistent track listing that contains all of the core elements of the Led Zeppelin sound, but also further expands into some other stylistic territories that we hadn't heard from them very much up to this point. It's 8 tracks long with 4 songs on each side, and similar to Led Zeppelin IV, I do not think there is a bad song on this album. It opens up beautifully with The Song Remains the Same, which is a Led Zeppelin classic, and kickstarts the album with a really great energy, and then the remainder of side 1 delivers a diverse palette of different styles with The Rain Song, which is a beautiful down-tempo track that takes on some art rock and prog rock sorts of characteristics, another favorite Led Zeppelin ballad of mine, and Over the Hills and Far Away gives us a nice blend of folk rock and hard rock, and then The Crunge concludes side 1 in a very cool style, almost like a fusion of funk and prog rock. The groove is very funky, but the main riff is actually in 9/8 time, which is more of a prog rock characteristic, and 9/8 is much less common than 5/8 and 7/8, and I think this is one of the coolest rock songs written in 9, and one of the more underrated Led Zeppelin tracks in my opinion. I know a lot of people hate on this song, but I personally think it's a really unique sounding song with all sorts of just cool layers and different elements to it. Side 2 then delivers another 4 amazing tracks with the hard rock flavors of Dancing Days and The Ocean. The Ocean is another song utilizing odd time signatures, with the main riff being 3 bars of 4/4 and then a bar of 3/4. Super cool riff and a great closing track to the record. And in addition to these 2 tracks, we also have the reggae flavors of Didja Maker, which is a song that some people seem to be divided on, but I've always regarded it as an awesome and classic Led Zeppelin track. And then No Quarter takes us on this awesome prog rock journey with lots of hard-hitting riffs, but also lots of dynamic shifts with tasteful instrumentations, utilizing the synthesizer and electric piano. And in general, I just think this record is packed with so many amazing tracks, and it really gives you a little bit of everything that we had heard from Led Zeppelin up to that point, with the hard rock, folk rock, art and prog rock elements, combined with these new dabblings in funk and reggae, which makes for a great album that gives the listener everything that they want to hear, and then surprises them with some of these new sounds that I think were very fitting for them at this point in their discography as the follow-up to the first 4 self-titled albums. So an amazing record, which goes down as my favorite Led Zeppelin album. Again, that might surprise some people, but after going through their discography and listening to these over the years, this has always just fallen as my favorite Led Zeppelin album, so that's how I feel. So this one gets an easy S. Okay, next we have their 6th studio album from 1975 titled Physical Graffiti, and I'm going to give this an A. Similar to Led Zeppelin III, this is another score where I feel like some people will be surprised that I'm not putting it in S tier, and it does pain me to not be able to put it all the way on top, because I do think this is a fantastic album, but there is one thing about it that takes away from it a little bit for me, and we will get to that in a bit. But of all of the albums that I've put in A tier up to this point, Physical Graffiti would definitely be my favorite. This is a double album at 83 minutes in length and 15 tracks long, and I will say it is very consistent for a double album, but for me, most of the time when I listen to a double album, because the length is so much longer and there are usually about double the amount of songs, it does increase the likelihood of there being a couple of tracks on here that I'm not crazy about, and I do get that a bit with this album, but I would say about 90% of this record is incredible. Stylistically, they deliver the full range of different styles that we've heard from them up to this point, between the hard rock, blues, progressive rock, and folk rock elements, and it makes for a very dynamic and enjoyable track listing that keeps things very engaging throughout. Side 1 kicks things off very strong with 3 back-to-back awesome songs. My favorite would have to be The Rover. I think that song just grooves so hard, and I think Side 2 is perfect. In my opinion, it is definitely the strongest side from this album with 3 back-to-back Led Zeppelin classics with Houses of the Holy, Trampled Underfoot, and Kashmir. Kashmir would be my favorite track from this album and a top 3 favorite Led Zeppelin song for me. That was the first song I ever heard from them as a kid. I remember so vividly being in the backseat of my parents' car and hearing this song come on the radio, and as a kid I was so intrigued by the sound of it, and when I later found out who the band was, I listened to it over and over and over again, and it's one of those songs I can still listen to this day and never get tired of it. A great example again of another polyrhythm between the guitar and drums, which is very cool from a music theory perspective. Side 3 would be my second favorite side of music from this record. It delivers 4 tracks that I think offer the most stylistic variety with the prog elements of In the Light and 10 Years Gone. Then we get the acoustic folk flavors of Bron Ur R, which is a beautiful instrumental Jimmy Page feature, and Down by the Seaside goes into more of a country rock direction, and I think that is a very beautiful song. And I love all 4 of these tracks, but if I had to pick 2 favorites, I would go with the more proggy tracks, In the Light and 10 Years Gone. And like I had mentioned on the previous record, that side of the Led Zeppelin sound personally resonates with me the most. So you're probably wondering, all right, why did you put this in A tier? Up to this point, you've had nothing but good things to say about this record. And now when we get to side 4, this is where it does start to lose me a little bit, and is ultimately why I did put it in A tier instead of S. If I was scoring this record just from the first 3 sides alone, it would be an easy S for me. But side 4 does have a few tracks that I'm not crazy about, like Boogie with Stu, Black Country Woman, and Sick Again. Stylistically, these tracks have never really resonated with me, but I do think the Wonton song is incredible. And the opening track, Night Flight, is also a solid song, but in the grand scheme of the album, I don't think it is particularly exciting. So it does pain me that I don't like those few tracks, because up to that point in the album, I think it is so incredibly consistent with such a great palette of different styles and so many standout and exceptional tracks. But then I think some of the choices on side 4 do ultimately leave this album off on a slightly underwhelming note and does take away from the record a bit for me. But regardless of that, this is still an incredibly consistent double album with a great selection of tracks that show all of the sides of the Led Zeppelin sound and further expand it into some newer territories. And it contains 2 tracks that would make my top 10 favorite Led Zeppelin track list, with Kashmir and Trampled Underfoot. So while I do understand why some people regard this as their best album, I do think they have a couple of others that are a bit stronger and more consistent, but this is still certainly an amazing album that was right on the cusp of getting an S, and a very strong double album. So I will give this an A. Alright, next we have their 7th studio album from 1976 titled Presence, and I'll give this a B. I think this is a pretty good album, definitely not as bad as some people say it is, but at the same time I don't think it's as strong as the 6 albums that preceded it, but it still has some great songs that still contain all of the sounds that I look for in Led Zeppelin. There's plenty of tasty and groovy guitar riffs and awesome guitar solos, as well as some great drum and bass grooves with plenty of intricate rhythms, and vocally, Robert Plant still sounds great, despite the fact that he was recovering from a car accident from the year prior, and was recording this album under less than ideal circumstances. It's 7 tracks long, with 3 songs on side 1 and 4 songs on side 2, and Jimmy Page and Robert Plant wrote all of the songs on here, with the exception of Royal Orleans, which was written by all 4 of them. I think side 1 is pretty solid. In particular, the opening track, Achilles' Last Stand, kicks things off with a really great drive to it. I also think For Your Life is a very cool song with some interesting rhythmic grooves going on between the guitars and the drums. I think the weakest song of side 1 would have to be the closer, Royal Orleans. I think it's an okay song, but I wouldn't say it's anything special in the grand scheme of Led Zeppelin songs. Side 2 then delivers a couple of other great tracks. I think the opening 2 songs in particular are both very strong, with Nobody's Fault But Mine and Candy Store Rock, which has some seriously groovy guitar and drum parts. Definitely one of the standout songs of this record for me. And Hot's On for Nowhere is also a very cool and groovy track. And the closer, T for One, isn't a bad song, but it would be my least favorite track on this album. I don't think it's the strongest closer, ending with a slower 9.5 minute blues in 6/8. It does start to feel a little monotonous after a while, at least for me. I would have preferred something a little more hard hitting and higher energy for the conclusion of the record, but I do enjoy the majority of the tracks tracks on here. It's got a few songs that I don't think are anything special, but largely I do think it's a pretty consistent album. I wouldn't consider any of these tracks to be any of my favorite Led Zeppelin songs. I do think the 6 albums before it do have more standout and exceptional tracks. So even though I do think it is good, it ultimately felt the most fitting to put it in B tier, but still not a bad album by any stretch, and still has plenty of cool songs with lots of great qualities to it. So a good album, I will give this a B. Okay, next we have their 8th studio album from 1979 titled In Through the Outdoor, and I'm going to give this a C. Not a great album in my opinion. I think it's a bit of a downgrade from Presence on a variety of fronts. This would be the last album to feature John Bonham before his death, which would be a little over a year after the release of this record. And musically, a lot of the writing on here is being done by Robert Plant and John Paul Jones, with Jimmy Page contributing on a couple of tracks, and in general, I just don't find the songwriting to be as interesting or as engaging on this record as it was on all of the previous releases. There are a couple of songs on here that I do like, but there's also a fair share of songs that I'm not crazy about, and one track in particular that I would regard as my least favorite Led Zeppelin song. And in addition to some of the subpar songwriting, I also find that Robert Plant's vocals don't have the same power and intensity like they did on the other albums, and the use of synthesizers becomes much more prevalent on here, which I like on certain songs, but I'm also not crazy about on other songs. And in my opinion, it sounds like a very different band in comparison to the earlier part of their discography, which is understandable given that it's 1979 and the musical landscape is completely different. But I don't think their efforts on this one translated into a very strong record. It's 7 tracks long with 4 songs on side 1 and 3 songs on side 2. I find the majority of side 1 pretty underwhelming. The only song that I really like on it would be Fool in the Rain, which is a song that I do absolutely love. That might even make my top 10 favorite Led Zeppelin song list, and I particularly love John Bonham's drum beat on this one. Hot Dog is the track that would go down as my least favorite Led Zeppelin song. Stylistically, I think it's just such a bizarre choice for them to make and doesn't really seem like it fits in with their sound or with this album at all. I do think side 2 is stronger, though. I enjoy all 3 songs on side 2, which is ultimately what saved this from being put in D tier and bumped it up to C. Of the 3 songs on here, my favorite would have to be All My Love, which is an example of them using the synthesizers in a way that I think is very tasteful and resulted in one of the best songs of the later part of the Led Zeppelin discography. And even though I do like side 2 a bit more, it wouldn't contain any tracks that I would regard as any of my favorite Led Zeppelin songs, other than the one exception of Fool in the Rain on side 2, but that would really be the only exceptional track on here for me. So that, combined with a pretty underwhelming side 1, resulted in what I think is their worst album up to this point. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to give this a C. Okay, and lastly, we have their compilation album from 1982 titled Coda, and I'm also going to give this a C. This is an okay album, but not great. I do like it slightly better than In Through the Outdoor, so this would be my second least favorite record of theirs, but there are still some redeeming qualities to it. So this is a collection of unused songs from a variety of different recording sessions and a couple of live tracks, and it was released after the death of John Bonham. And largely how I feel about this album is that it's got a few songs that I really enjoy, sandwiched in between some more underwhelming tracks. I will say that from a stylistic standpoint, it does sound a lot more like that old Led Zeppelin sound, whereas In Through the Outdoor was veering into some new sounds and different territories. But even though it sounds more like classic Led Zeppelin, I don't think it translates into a very cohesive and consistent album. It's 8 tracks long with 4 songs on each side. And the 3 songs that I really like on here would be Poor Tom, Ozone Baby, and Darlene. Poor Tom would be my favorite track on here. I particularly like the guitar work, and those would be the couple of high points for me. But after that, it does have a couple of songs that I find kind of boring, like We're Gonna Groove, I Can't Quit You Baby, and Walter's Walk. The other remaining tracks I think are okay, but nothing special. Bonzo's Montreux is an okay drum feature, but I do think the placement of it feels kind of random and out of place. place. And Wearing and Tearing, I would say, is a decent song, but other than the 3 songs I had mentioned, I don't think anything else on here really stands out, especially in comparison to most of the tracks from their first 7 albums. But it still delivered a couple of decent tracks that hadn't been released up to that point, which is still enough to satisfy a diehard Led Zeppelin fan. But overall, I think this album is okay, but nothing special, so I will give it a C. Alright, so those are my takes on their 8 studio albums as well as their compilation album. I've done a bunch of these ranking videos over the years. This is now my 67th tier list, and I feel like this might be one of the most unorthodox rankings that I've done up to this point, especially with Houses of the Holy being my favorite and not having Led Zeppelin III or Physical Graffiti in my top 3. So I do look forward to hearing what people think of this ranking in the comments. This was a group where I really didn't know how I felt about a lot of their albums in terms of how I would rank them, and when I went back and re-listened, I was definitely surprised with how everything turned out. But that is part of the fun with making these videos and figuring out where each album lines up. But like I said at the beginning, Led Zeppelin has been a band that I've loved for 20 years now, and I've covered almost every band that has had an influence on me on this channel at some point, but I realized I have never done a video on Led Zeppelin in all of the years of doing this channel. So this was long overdue, and I'm glad to have finally gotten around to it. So that is it for today. Thank you so much for listening. I hope it was enjoyable, and if you are interested, please feel free to check out some of my other tier lists linked in the comments and the description and see if there's anything else that you might like. And please let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree and how you would rank these 9 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. Alright, that's it for today. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you at the next video. Take care.